My name is Laura Myers. I am the manager of gallery learning here at the Heinz History Center, and we are starting our second in a series of talks, Uncovering Pittsburgh Stories. It's a program put together by our Heinz History Center docents. Those are the friendly tour guides that you see at the History Center when we're open, giving tours to school students and groups, families throughout the building. During this time of closure, we've been looking for ways to reach out and share Pittsburgh's rich history with you. And one of the ways that we are doing that is by inviting docents to share some of the stories that they have been learning about and researching about the Pittsburgh region. Today, I'm happy to invite Bill Evans to talk to us. He is a docent who's been with us for quite a while and knows an awful lot about Pittsburgh history. He'll be talking to us about Homestead today. We are streaming live, but we will be answering questions at the end. So please, as you listen, feel free to type in questions and we will share those with Bill when we're done with his portion of the presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Laura. Let me bring up my screen. I think. There it is. Okay, you're seeing a introduction slide that shows the Homestead Mill. So today we're going to explore the Homestead Strike of 1892. Some of the circumstances leading up to the strike, or more formally a lockout, and the late 18th and 19th century social conditions contributing to the labor problems. The Homestead Strike of 1892 is notorious for its violence. 16 people were killed and scores were wounded. But it was not a success for the labor movement. On the contrary, violence in Homestead and later strikes elsewhere turned public opinion against labor, and the labor movement didn't gain real power until Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal legislation of the 1930s. There is, however, another reason to study the 1890 strike. It illustrates, as we shall see, a transition point in the evolution of the Industrial Revolution from skilled craftsmen to mass manufacturing using mostly unskilled labor. But let's start at the beginning. Homestead is a small town about 10 miles upstream from downtown Pittsburgh on the south bank of the Monongahela River. It's an old mill town today with a modern shopping district. But in 1840, the view from Homestead may have looked something like this. Something like that. And it's not doing it. There it is. This is actually a photograph about 2015, taken from the pump house in Homestead. The old pump house was part of the Homestead Steelworks. It's no longer there. And this happens to be a thing called the Lambeth. It's a historical type marker that shows the various mills that were in the area. And it's there next to the pump house. But I chose this picture because I couldn't find a picture of Homestead in 1840. And so I took this more recent picture because this is what Homestead probably looked like in 1840. No mills and a clean river. It so happens that in 1840, Homestead was a resort area. The people that lived in Pittsburgh, which was already smoky and dirty, would come to Homestead on picnics just to get out of the bad air, which is kind of ironic. It also had a poorhouse which later became a mental hospital. And later on, it moved to Upper St. Clair and became Mayview Mental Hospital, which some of you may remember. So that was Homestead in 1840. That's how the town started. It started as a resort area. Now let's take a look at one of our main characters here. Maybe the main character, and that's Andrew Carnegie. Now, Andrew Carnegie is a famous person who had a great influence on the Pittsburgh area. He is responsible for us being called the Steel City because he's responsible for most of the steel mills that were built here in the area. I'll just give you a brief biography of Andrew Carnegie. He was born in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland. It's kind of a coincidence, but General John Forbes, the general that actually founded Pittsburgh, he is the general that chased the French away in 1758. He was also born in Dunfermline, Scotland. So it's kind of a famous place. But Andy Carnegie and his parents came to Pittsburgh in 1848 because Andy's father lost his job, which was as a weaver in Scotland. He lost his job because of the Industrial Revolution. And when power looms came in, he could no longer find a job, so they came to Pittsburgh. And Andy, being only 12 years old with a fourth grade education, was a very industrious boy. He started working as a bobbin boy in a textile mill, and then he graduated to being a telegrapher. He was such a good telegrapher that the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, one Edgar Thompson, hired him to be his personal telegrapher. And so Andrew started to make money. He started to get stock tips from the president of the railroad. And by the time of the Civil War, which started in 1861, as we all know, Andy was pretty well along as a businessman working for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Then after the Civil War, he started to buy up iron mills in addition to his other things that he had bought previously, like oil wells and gas wells. He started to buy up iron mills. Now, at the time, iron was made by a process called puddling that we'll get into a little bit. But this was before the era of mass steelmaking. There was a product called wrought iron, which was made by skilled workers. These are the sorts of businesses that Andy bought. However, in the 1870s, there was an invention called the Bessemer Converter, which made it easy to make mass-produced steel rather than wrought iron. And Andy got this new equipment, this new technology, and he built his first integrated mill in Braddock called the Edgar Thompson Works. He named it after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And then in 1888, he bought an existing mill in Homestead and founded the Homestead Works, and went on to become a great industrialist. And then in 1901, he sold all of his mills to the United States Steel Corporation and became a great philanthropist, building Carnegie libraries and music halls and endowing what is now Carnegie Mellon University. So that's a brief biography of Andrew Carnegie. Here's another picture of Andrew as a much younger man, probably, I would think, in his 40s or 50s in this picture. And so we go to this picture, a picture of a puddler. I mentioned this is how iron was made, we'll say before 1865. This picture just happens to be one that was in the History Center maybe 10 years ago, and I took a picture of that picture at that time. This product called wrought iron was made by skilled workers. You can see a puddler and his rabble, and he takes what is called pig iron, which comes from a blast furnace, and he starts to react it with a little bit of iron ore to take the carbon out of it. And as he's taking the carbon out of it, the mixture's melting temperature goes up and forms a sort of a semi-solid ball. And he has to work that ball and then bring it out of the furnace. The ball probably weighed between 100 and 200 pounds. So you can imagine these workers were very strong and also very skilled because they had to know when to take it out. And after they took it out, they would then work it. They would beat it with hammers or put it through rollers to get rid of the other impurities. And their product was something that was almost pure iron with slag stringers in it. And this was called wrought iron. And it was the main construction material before the invention of the mass production of steel. So we go now to that invention by Sir Henry Bessemer called the Bessemer Converter. Again, this is a picture I took of the Bessemer Converter, which is at Station Square, which is on the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh. If anybody wants to see a Bessemer, they can get down there and see it. Now, the Bessemer was a very important invention because you could take and put molten steel or molten pig iron from the blast furnace, and you could put that in this big vessel, And then you could blow air from the bottom up through that pig iron and get rid of impurities like carbon and sulfur and phosphorus and other sorts of impurities. And the result was a material which was largely iron and a little bit of carbon. And that's what we call steel. And it was possible to mass produce steel that way using unskilled labor. And so this is the new technology that Andrew Carnegie procured for his plants. And now we go to the plant, his very first integrated steel mill, which he built on the banks of the Monongahela River about 1875. By integrated, I mean the plant was able to take raw iron ore and a material called coke, which is a processed coal, almost pure carbon, and take those materials along with limestone and produce what we call steel, and then process steel into useful shapes like rails for railroads or plates to be rolled into sheet. So this was Andy Carnegie's first integrated mill in Braddock. He named it after Edgar Thompson, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad that he worked for. And then as he started to make more and more money, he decided to branch out, and he bought a mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania. It was called the Pittsburgh Bessemer Steel Company. He bought it in 1888 and expanded it to become the Homestead Works. And this is where the strike of 1890 took place in the Homestead Works, again on the banks of Monongahela River, 10 miles upstream from Pittsburgh. The plant, though, was actually in Munhall. There's a lot of confusion about geography here. The steelworks itself was in the borough of Munhall, which was incorporated after the mill was bought. And the workers themselves lived in Homestead. And I'll show you a map of that in a little bit. This is another view of the Homestead Steelworks about 1905. This is looking from the hill opposite the mill, looking over 8th Avenue, Homestead, towards the Monongahela River. And you're probably looking at an open hearth, either open hearth 1 or open hearth 2. And across the river, you can see blast furnaces. That would be Cary Furnace. That's where they made the pig iron. And then transported it across the Monongahela River to be processed in the steelworks. So if we take a look at a map of the Homestead Munhall area in 1892, the mill itself was largely in Munhall. And so the border between Homestead and Munhall was about right here. The plant itself was largely in Munhall, whereas the workers, particularly the hourly workers, lived over here in Homestead. Now, if you see, it's hard, I guess our pictures is blocking out this cutout up here. But Pittsburgh is about 10 miles downriver from Homestead here. This is the hot metal bridge. This is where they bring the pig iron across from the blast furnaces to the Homestead Works. And this is the pump house here on the Monongahela River. The first picture I showed was from the pump house where we saw the Lambert. This is also the site of where the replacement workers, the Pinkertons, tried the land during the 1892 strike. So we'll come back to this map in a little bit. This is actually an aerial view showing Homestead today. And I included this just for perspective. You can see the waterfront shopping center where the mill used to be. That's right there. This bridge is the Homestead high-level bridge. Well, at least previously it was called that. Today it's called the Homestead Grays Bridge. And this goes over to a section of Pittsburgh called Squirrel Hill. Squirrel Hill is up here. That's a little part of the edge of Squirrel Hill across the Grays Bridge. So you can see that Homestead is a very strategic location, close to the city of Pittsburgh and close to a lot of residential areas. Okay. Now we have another character, another chief culprit in our strike, and that's Henry Clay Frick. Henry Clay Frick actually operated the Homestead Works for Andy Carnegie. He was the superintendent of the Homestead Works. And just before the strike, the company had a logistical problem, or they had a monetary problem. The skilled workers who worked in the Homestead Works, and these skilled workers were workers like the peddlers. They still had some peddlers working in the mill, and they had other skilled workers like people that manned the furnaces. They were called heaters, and people that did forgings. They were called forgers. And so they had skilled workers who worked on piece count. That is, the more they produced, the more they made. So they worked on what was called tonnage. So they made money as a result of the tons of product that they put out. Well, the Homestead Mill was a very modern mill, and the workers made good money there because they had good equipment. So Frick and Carnegie decided that they were making too much money because they had good equipment, and workers in the other mills didn't have that equipment and couldn't make that much money. So they decided that they were going to cut the wages of the skilled workers, and they were going to cut the wages of the hourly workers too. The hourly workers tended to be the Eastern European immigrants who came in, who did the manual labor. So they tried to negotiate a contract on that basis, and the Steelworkers Union, called the Amalgamated at the time, they decided that they weren't going to do that. So Frick and Carnegie locked out the workers. They refused to let them into the plant. And so that's why this strike is technically a lockout and not a strike. So when they did that, they decided, Frick and Carnegie decided they would bring in replacement workers to operate the mill. And so they brought replacement workers up the Monongahela River, guarded by detectives that worked for the Pinkerton Detective Company. And so those workers, replacement workers at the time, were called Pinkertons. And when they attempted to land these workers right next to the pump house, and I'll show you where that was on the map. Right there at the pump house is where they attempted to land the workers, the replacement workers. But when they tried that, this is what the townspeople did. They revolted, and they stopped the Pinkerton replacements from disembarking from the barges and going in the mills to operate the mills. It was a pretty violent thing that happened. 9 workers and 7 Pinkertons were killed. And the workers actually controlled the town of Homestead, from July 2nd to July 12th, 1892. Considered one of the most violent strikes in the labor movement. Now, this strike did not work. For a time, the workers took over the town, and they were planning to also reopen the mill. But Carnegie and also the officials of the town of Homestead then decided that this couldn't happen, and they sent in the militia. And in 1892, they sent in the Pennsylvania National Guard. Here's a picture of the National Guard marching and being bivouacked in what was actually Munhall. There was a hill opposite the river, and they were up on the river overlooking the town. They had 8,000 militiamen who marched into Homestead to put down the riot. Now, this is kind of interesting based on the events, the present day events of today. This riot was a labor riot, and these people rioted and took over the town. And the Governor Stone, sent in the militia to restore order. Here's another view of that militia. Thing I think is interesting about these pictures are that the soldiers are wearing uniforms very reminiscent of the Civil War. The Civil War was over about 28 years at this time, but it doesn't look like the uniforms changed very much. You can see the Kewpie hat, you see the cartridge belt, and you can see that they have fixed bayonets. And they are marching probably on 8th Avenue in Homestead, but it could be 7th or a lower avenue. And they came in and restored order. And Actually, the strike lasted until November 30th, but the strike was broken, the amalgamated lost, and they had to go back to work. A lot of workers were blackballed and couldn't get their jobs back, and the mills were reopened. There was another very violent strike in 1919 where another union, another budding union called the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, they combined with the amalgamated and struck the industry in 1919. That was a violent strike also, but that also failed. And the strikes failed because of the bad publicity of the violence that happened during those strikes. And actually, the labor movement really didn't succeed very much until the New Deal legislation of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. Okay, we're almost out of time, so I want to just bring up some of the living conditions of the hourly workers, the immigrants that came to work in Carnegie's mill because he needed a lot of unskilled labor. Okay, these were typically Eastern and Southern immigrants, largely. They typically lived in a 2-room tenement and some only 1 room. And a lot of times the housewives would rent out the beds twice, 1 bed for a worker on day shift and another bed for a worker on night shift. And they would also provide board, that is, they provide meals for these workers. And so you can see that the housewives were very busy. These are some of the immigrants. These immigrants are Eastern European, but I happen to know that they're from Russia. And they're typical of the Eastern Europeans who came to work in Andy's mills. And most were young, most were single. They all intended to go, a lot of them intended to go back home after they made money. But many of them met their wives here in the United States, got married and stayed. And a lot of them couldn't go back because the First World War happened. And then travel was restricted back to Europe. And last but not least, I'd like to show you a picture of the immigrant children. These are first-generation Americans. Unfortunately, we cannot see this little girl here who has a very severe look on her face. And I just show this picture to show that a lot of these immigrant who came at that time had children and stayed, and these children are today's parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents of many present-day Pittsburghers, including myself. So that's the end of my presentation. I went a little bit long, but not too bad. Laura?
Thank you, Bill. We're going to stop sharing your screen there. I'm going to turn that off for me.
Turn it off for you. Okay.
I just did it for you. Thank you, Bill, for sharing with us a little bit about the history of Homestead. I know that we are checking out the questions as they come in. One of the questions that I had for you, and you and I have talked about this a little bit in the past, I am not a native Pittsburgher, and so a lot of my learning happens from talking to people who have grown up here. And I know in your presentation that you sometimes talk about Andy Carnegie, and I was hoping that you could share a little bit about why you refer to him sometimes as Andrew and sometimes as Andy.
Well, he apparently didn't like to be called Andy. He preferred Andrew, but his name was used quite a bit when I was growing up. My grandparents and my parents both worked in the Homestead Works. And so when they talked about Carnegie, they tended to use the familiar name, Andy. It's because they weren't quite happy with the working conditions that he presented. My grandfather actually started working for the Carnegie Steel Corporation. And then shortly after he started, it went over to U.S. Steel, but it was still called the Carnegie Works.
Great. I always love hearing about your family connection to this place. I think it seems to me to be maybe one of the reasons that you researched this topic, but is there more to that? You know, what brought you to research about Homestead and share this with us today? And was there anything that you found while doing this research that surprised you or sort of came out as something you hadn't thought too much about before putting this presentation together?
Yeah, I always was impressed by the fact that it wasn't the hourly workers that struck in 1892. It was the skilled workers. And these were workers who considered that they had built the mill along with Carnegie. They considered themselves to be partners with Carnegie and Frick. And so one of the reasons why they took such exception to being treated the way they were treated was because they considered themselves to be owners of the plant also, and that they should share in the success. And so it wasn't the hourly workers. The hourly workers were, in general, the Eastern European immigrants who really didn't join in so much. It was the skilled workers that actually did the strike and the lockout. And I was really kind of impressed by that because I don't think that's generally appreciated. Also, I don't think it's generally appreciated that the strike was a failure. You know, it did not achieve the labor's demands. It was put down, and actually, before the strike, the workers had an 8-hour day that the union had won for them. After the strike, they went back to a 12-hour day. So they actually regressed because of that strike.
And it sounds like that was the intent all along from the perspective of Frick and Carnegie, was to roll back some of those things that had been enjoyed by some of the workers at the mill.
Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, Frick was considered more of the culprit in the labor relations than Carnegie was. Carnegie was kind of a father figure. He, as a matter of fact, during the strike, he wasn't even there. He was in Scotland, and he let Frick take do all the work, so to speak. And I didn't get into the assassination attempt. Shortly after the strike, there was an attempt on Frick's life by an anarchist, somebody who wasn't even associated with the labor movement. And that again turned people away from the labor movement because they associated that violence with the labor movement, even though it wasn't.
It seems like there's some interesting connections there. And one connection there is that we talk a little bit about that assassination attempt in our newest exhibit, Smithsonian's Portraits of Pittsburgh, which is opening up at the History Center on July 1st. So a little plug there. We have been doing these talks as a way to share a little bit during the time of closure, but just to share with everyone, the History Center, Fort Pitt and Meadowcroft will all be opening back up on July 1st, which is next Wednesday. I know the docents, myself, everyone else who hasn't been in the museum for a while, we're excited to see that latest exhibit and the other pieces in the museum we haven't seen in a while in person. Bill, I think we're going to wrap up here. Excuse me. I wanted to let everyone else know that we will continue to do these talks every 2 weeks on Tuesdays throughout the summer, so that if you can't visit us in person, or if you can do both, you can also visit us online through these talks and other offerings that we have. I want to thank you so much, Bill, for doing this today. I think we are all learning new skills and sharing them, and I'm so glad that we're getting to do this. So thank you for being a part of it, and thanks everyone for coming out and joining us today.